Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the science underpinning atomic bombs,
Hmm.
really looking at what makes them so unbelievably destructive.
Right. Our goal is to kind of dissect the core mechanisms,
Yeah.
moving past just the iconic images to really grasp the fundamental science that gives these weapons their, well, terrifying power.
Absolutely. I mean, these are devices that have just fundamentally altered warfare, international relations, everything, really.
Yeah.
The sheer scale of devastation we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's still a pivotal, almost incomprehensible point in history.
And it's really vital we understand this kind of duality here.
Hmm.
These bombs, they represent a remarkable feat of scientific discovery, right?
Yeah.
Pushing the boundaries of our
A
knowledge.
huge achievement, yeah.
But at the same time, they serve as this incredibly stark warning about the potential consequences of wielding that knowledge.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start at the very heart of it. Nuclear fission. What's actually happening at the atomic level to unleash all that energy?
Well, the story really kicks off back in 1938. You had the discovery of nuclear fission by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. But the full picture, the theory behind it, that came from Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, they explained what was actually going on.
Which was?
Essentially, fission starts when a neutron, just a subatomic particle, hits the nucleus of a heavy atom. We're typically talking about isotopes like uranium-235 or maybe plutonium-239.
And an isotope is just like a heavier version of the element?
Kind of. Same element, so
Mm.
same number of protons, but a different number of neutrons in the nucleus. And that difference can really affect its stability.
Got it. So this neutron hits the nucleus and the atom just breaks apart.
Exactly. The impact makes the nucleus incredibly unstable, and poof, it splits, usually into two smaller nuclei. We call those fission products.
Ah,
But here's the crucial part, the really interesting bit. This splitting doesn't just happen. It also ejects more neutrons.
setting up the next step.
Right. And it releases a truly staggering amount of energy.
And this energy, where's it coming from? I always think of Einstein, E men Ca, JMS C1. Is that basically it?
That's absolutely the key. Einstein's famous equation is the fundamental explanation. What happens is a tiny, tiny fraction of the original atom's mass gets directly converted into energy.
A tiny fraction, but it makes a huge difference.
A huge difference because the c in that equation is the speed of light, and it's squared. That's an enormous number. So even a minuscule amount of mass converting results in an absolutely extraordinary release of energy, mostly as heat and gamma radiation.
Can you give us a sense of scale, like compare it to a normal explosion, TNT or something?
Oh, the difference is just immense. Fissioning one single uranium-235 atom releases around 200 million electron volts MeV. That's the unit we use at the atomic scale.
Okay.
Now compare that to a typical chemical reaction like TNT exploding. That might release just a few electron volts per molecule, maybe 3 or 4 eV.
Wow, so millions of times more powerful atom for atom.
Exactly. Millions. It's almost hard to properly compare, like a spark versus a massive lightning bolt, but even that doesn't quite capture it.
Right, so one atom splitting packs this incredible punch. But how do you get from one atom to Hiroshima? That must be the chain reaction, right?
Precisely. Those extra neutrons released during the first fission event, they go on to strike other nearby fissile nuclei, more U-235 or P-239 atoms.
Causing them to split, too.
Correct. And they release more neutrons, which hit more atoms, which release more neutrons. If you have enough of this fissile material packed together, what we call the critical mass, this whole process becomes self-sustaining.
Like nuclear dominoes.
Exactly like dominoes, but each one knocks over maybe 2 or 3 others. It escalates incredibly quickly.
It's exponential increase.
Yes, and it happens in tiny fractions of a second, nanoseconds, microseconds. This rapid multiplication of fission events is what generates that massive sudden energy release, the explosion.
Okay, critical mass, how much material are we talking about? Is it a fixed amount?
No, it's not fixed. It actually depends on several things. First, the material itself, U-235 and Pu-239, have different critical masses naturally.
Okay.
Then, density. The more you compress the material, the closer the atoms are, the easier it is for neutrons to find another nucleus, so the less material you need overall to reach criticality.
Makes sense.
And then there's something called neutron reflectors. You can surround the fissile core with certain materials that basically bounce escaping neutrons back into the core.
Making it more efficient.
Exactly. Increases the efficiency, reduces the amount of precious fissile material you need. So you see, the engineering is quite intricate. Getting it just right is crucial. Small miscalculations could mean it doesn't work, or worse. Yeah. Well, it's high stakes.
So with good design, you need less of this dangerous stuff.
That's right. For example, a bare sphere of U-235, just on its own, needs about 50 kilograms to be critical. But add a good reflector, maybe compress it a bit, you could bring that down to maybe 15, 20 kilograms.
Just sounds like a lot.
It is. Plutonium-239 is naturally more efficient. Its bare sphere critical mass is lower, around 10 kilograms. Maybe only 5 or 6 kilograms with a reflector.
Okay, even 10 or 15 kilos. That's a substantial amount of very specific, hard-to-get material. How do you actually assemble it? You have to keep it subcritical until the last moment, right? Prevent it from going off early.
That is the absolute core engineering challenge. You always store the fissile material in pieces, each one subcritical, meaning it can't sustain a chain reaction on its own.
Right.
The trick is to bring these separate pieces together very, very rapidly to form a single mass that is supercritical, bigger than the critical threshold at the exact instant you want the detonation.
And if you're too slow.
If the assembly isn't fast enough, some fission starts happening prematurely, it generates heat, pushes the material apart before the chain reaction can fully develop. You get what's called a fizzle, a much, much weaker explosion, far less efficient. Basically, a dud, relatively speaking.
So speed is everything, and that
Yeah.
leads to the two main designs, the gun type and the implosion type.
Exactly. The gun type design was used for Little Boy, the Hiroshima bomb.
Yeah.
It's conceptually, at least, simpler. You basically use conventional explosives, like gunpowder, to fire one subcritical piece of uranium-235 down a barrel into another subcritical piece.
Like loading a gun.
Pretty much. Joining two puzzle pieces very fast to make the supercritical whole. It's less efficient, though, and it really only works reliably with uranium-235.
Okay. And Fat Man in Nagasaki used the implosion design. Sounds way more complicated.
Oh, it is. Much more complex, but also more efficient. And critically, it's the design you generally have to use for plutonium.
Why is that?
Plutonium, especially reactor-grade plutonium, has isotopes that fission spontaneously more often. If you tried the gun method, it would likely fizzle. So with implosion, you take a subcritical sphere of plutonium,
Okay.
and you surround it with this incredibly precise arrangement of conventional high explosives shaped into lenses.
Lenses to focus the blast.
Exactly. When these explosives are all detonated simultaneously and the timing has to be perfect, down to microseconds, they create a powerful, uniform shock wave that travels inwards.
Squeezing the plutonium core?
Precisely. It compresses the plutonium sphere very rapidly to a much higher density, forcing it into a supercritical state. It's a much more efficient way to initiate the chain reaction, allows you to use less material, and generally gives a bigger bang for your buck, so to speak.
Fascinating. And yeah, deeply unsettling science and engineering there. So that covers fission, but you mentioned modern weapons often use fusion too, thermonuclear, hydrogen bombs. Are they just scaled up fission bombs?
Not exactly. They're a whole other level, really. While fission was the energy source for Little Boy and Fat Man, most modern nuclear weapons, the ones we call thermonuclear or H-bombs, they actually harness nuclear fusion for the bulk of their destructive power. Much, much greater yields are possible.
Okay, fusion. Fission is splitting atoms, so fusion must be joining them together.
That's it, in a nutshell. Fusion is essentially the reverse. Instead of splitting heavy nuclei, you're forcing light atomic nuclei to combine, or fuse, to form a heavier nucleus.
What kind of light nuclei?
Typically isotopes of hydrogen, like deuterium, which is hydrogen with one extra neutron, and tritium, hydrogen with two extra neutrons. When they fuse, they form a helium nucleus.
And like fission, this releases energy.
Yes, and a substantial amount. Actually, per reaction, like one deuterium fusing with one tritium, it releases about 17.6 MeV. That's actually more energy per event than a single fission event, though the starting materials are much lighter.
More energy. Sounds even worse. But there must be a catch.
There's a huge catch. To get these light nuclei, which are positively charged, close enough to actually fuse, you have to overcome their intense electrical repulsion. They naturally push each other apart.
So you need extreme conditions.
Unbelievably extreme. We're talking temperatures over 100 million degrees Celsius.
Hotter than the sun's core.
Hotter than the sun's core. And immense pressure. Creating those conditions requires a colossal input of energy to begin with.
And where does that energy come from? Wait, don't tell me.
You guessed it. A fission bomb.
So you use an atomic bomb just to set off the hydrogen bomb.
Exactly. In a thermonuclear weapon, the fission bomb acts as the primary stage, or the trigger. Its explosion creates the incredibly high temperatures and pressures needed to ignite the fusion, fuel the deuterium and tritium, usually in the form of lithium deuteride in a separate secondary stage.
A two-stage explosion, fission, ignites fusion.
That's the basic principle, yes. Fission provides the heat and pressure to kickstart a much, much larger fusion reaction, leading to those megaton range yields we hear about.
Incredible amplification of power. There's that quote in the source material from Hermann Goering, ironically talking about German science. It really hits home the sheer ambition and the, well, terrifying power involved.
It does. It highlights that this isn't just about the basic science, but the scale, the engineering to unleash that energy so devastatingly.
Right. Okay, we've got a handle on how the energy is released fission and fusion. Now let's talk about the destruction itself. What are the different ways an atomic bomb actually causes such catastrophe? It's not just one big bang, is it?
No, definitely not. It's a combination of several distinct, devastating effects happening almost simultaneously or in rapid succession. The first, and maybe the most obvious, is the blast wave.
The shock wave.
Exactly. A supersonic shock wave radiates out from the fireball. This intense pressure wave is what does most of the structural damage, flattening buildings, tossing vehicles, demolishing infrastructure.
How powerful are we talking?
Well, take Hiroshima. The bomb, little boy, was about 15 kilotons. That blast wave essentially leveled everything within about a 2-kilometer radius. Something like 90% of the buildings in that zone were just gone.
2 kilometers.
And that was just 15 kilotons, a modern 1-megaton weapon. You could be looking at a blast radius of maybe 10 to 15 kilometers for severe damage.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to really picture that scale of destruction.
Truly unimaginable. Okay, blast wave. What's next? The heat.
The thermal radiation, yes. The explosion creates this incredibly hot fireball temperatures reaching millions of degrees, like the surface of the sun.
So it radiates intense heat.
Intense heat and light, yes. It travels outward at the speed of light, causing severe burns to anyone exposed, even at considerable distances. It also ignites fires over a huge area. In Hiroshima, people within a kilometer suffered horrific third-degree burns instantly. And those fires, they merged into firestorms that burned for days, adding massively to the destruction and death toll. Thinking about the science is one thing, but this is the human cost.
Horrifying. And then the invisible killer, radiation.
Yes, ionizing radiation. The explosion releases a massive burst of gamma rays and neutrons right at the moment of detonation. This is called initial radiation.
And it damages living cells.
Directly, it tears through tissue, damaging DNA, killing cells. High doses cause acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. Within hours or days, you see symptoms like nausea, vomiting, hair loss, internal bleeding, organ failure.
And many died from this later on.
Thousands did, yes. In both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people who survived the initial blast and fires succumbed to radiation sickness in the following weeks and months. And even for survivors who didn't get ARS, their long-term risks significantly increased chances of developing leukemia, thyroid cancer, other cancers later in life.
And that's not all the radiation, right? There's also fallout.
Correct, that's the residual radiation. The fission process itself creates a whole cocktail of radioactive isotopes, the fission products. These get vaporized in the fireball, mixed with dirt and debris, and sucked up into the mushroom cloud.
And then it comes back down.
Exactly. It falls back to Earth over hours, days, even weeks, potentially contaminating huge areas downwind. This fallout gets into the air, the water, the soil.
Making areas uninhabitable.
Potentially for a very long time, depending on the isotopes and the concentration. Think about the Chernobyl exclusion zone. It's an example of long-term contamination from reactor products, similar in principle.
Yeah.
In Nagasaki, there was significant fallout reported up to 10 kilometers downwind, adding another layer of danger and long-term health problems. It's just wave after wave of destruction.
The source also mentions EMP, electromagnetic pulse. Was that a big factor back in 45?
Less so for the immediate ground-level destruction, then. EMP is mainly caused by the interaction of gamma rays with the atmosphere. It's a much bigger concern today, especially with the idea of high-altitude nuclear explosions.
How does that work?
A burst high up generates a powerful electromagnetic field that can induce damaging electrical currents in conductors over a vast area below. Think power lines, communication networks, anything electronic.
So it could potentially cripple modern society.
That's the concern, yes. Widespread blackout, loss of communications, frying sensitive electronics. It wasn't a primary destructive effect in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but it's a major factor in modern nuclear strategy and threat assessment.
It's just staggering, all these different mechanisms of destruction packed into one device. And of course, this isn't theoretical. We have the terrible reality of Hiroshima and Nagasaki,
Right.
the only times these weapons have been used in war.
A crucial point to remember, August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima, little boy, the uranium gun-type bomb. About 15 kilotons yield.
The immediate deaths, horrifying numbers.
Somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people killed instantly or within hours. But by the end of 1945, the total death toll is estimated around 140,000, factoring in injuries, burns, and radiation sickness.
And the city itself?
Devastated. Around 69%, over two-thirds of the city's buildings are destroyed. And the survivors, the Hibakusha, they've carried the physical and psychological scars ever since. Lifelong health problems, cancers, infertility, the trauma.
And just 3 days later, August 9th, Nagasaki.
Nagasaki. Fat Man, the plutonium implosion bomb. Bit more powerful, around 21 kilotons.
Were the casualties similar?
The immediate death toll was lower, maybe 35,000 to 40,000. Total by year's end, around 74,000. Still catastrophic, but slightly less than Hiroshima.
Why the difference if the bomb was stronger?
Partly the terrain. Nagasaki is situated in hilly valleys which actually contain the blast and thermal effects somewhat compared to the flat delta where Hiroshima sits. But the destruction in the Urakami Valley, where the bomb hit, was absolute. And fallout was a more significant issue there. Plus, the medical system was completely overwhelmed.
These two events, they didn't just end a war, did they? They changed the world.
Fundamentally. They certainly hastened Japan's surrender, ending World War II. But they also slammed the door shut on one era and violently threw open the door to the nuclear age. And almost immediately, the Cold War arms race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union began.
Leading to massive stockpiles.
Tens of thousands of nuclear warheads were built by both sides and later by other nations. Global diplomacy completely shifted. The whole concept of nuclear deterrence, amid mutually assured destruction, became central.
The idea that using them would destroy everyone so nobody would dare start it?
That's the terrifying logic, yes.
No?
And arguably, it has prevented large-scale direct war between major nuclear powers since 1945. But it's a peace based on holding a gun to humanity's head, and the threat has never truly gone away.
And the consequences go way beyond the immediate blasts and the geopolitical shifts, don't they? The long-term effects. Environmental health, psychological?
Absolutely. Environmentally, these explosions leave lasting scars. We talked about fallout, radioactive contamination of soil and water can persist for decades, even centuries for some isotopes.
Did Hiroshima and Nagasaki stay radioactive?
The initial intense radiation dropped off relatively quickly because the bombs were air bursts, which limits local fallout compared to ground bursts. But some longer-lived isotopes, like cesium-137 with its 30-year half-life, were deposited and can still be detected, though at low levels now. For a starker example, look at places like the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, where the U.S. conducted numerous much larger tests. It remains uninhabitable due to the levels of contamination.
And the long-term health effects on the survivors, the Hibakusha.
It's a tragic legacy. We already mentioned the significantly higher risks of various cancers. Leukemia rates peaked within a decade or so, but risks for solid tumors like breast, lung, and thyroid cancer remained elevated for decades.
Is there data on that?
Yes, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, or ERF, a joint U.S.-Japan effort, has been studying survivors for decades. A major 2006 report confirmed these increased risks, sometimes 10%, sometimes up to 44% higher depending on the cancer type and radiation dose received, even many years later.
What about effects on their children, genetic damage?
That's been studied extensively too. While the fear was significant, large-scale studies haven't found statistically significant increases in genetic mutations or birth defects in the children of survivors compared to control groups. That said, the potential is there, and it remains a concern, especially at the individual level. Rare effects might be missed in population studies.
Beyond the physical, the mental toll must be immense.
Profound. The psychological trauma for Hibakusha is hard to overstate. PTSD, survivor's guilt, anxiety, depression. Plus, they often face social stigma and discrimination in Japan, linked to fears about radiation or illness.
And this fear wasn't just limited to survivors, right? It spread globally.
Oh yes, the existence of these weapons cast a long shadow. The fear of nuclear annihilation became a defining feature of the Cold War era, permeating culture, politics. Think about the duck and cover drills, the constant anxiety during crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. That fear has shaped generations.
It also forces some really difficult ethical questions, doesn't it? The justification for using these bombs on civilian populations.
Absolutely. It remains a deeply debated topic. The main argument for their use was that they hastened the end of the war and ultimately saved lives, both Allied and Japanese, that would have been lost in a prolonged invasion of Japan.
And the arguments against?
Arguments against point out that Japan might have been close to surrendering anyway, perhaps through continued conventional bombing and the Soviet declaration of war. Critics also argue it was unnecessarily brutal against civilians, and perhaps partly intended as a demonstration of power aimed at the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cold War. There's also the moral question of whether any justification can cover the deliberate mass killing of civilians.
No easy answers there. It highlights the immense moral complexities that come with wielding such power.
Exactly.
Let's shift gears slightly. The sheer engineering feat required to build these things in the first place, the Manhattan Project. It was enormous, wasn't it?
Unprecedented. We're talking about mobilizing over 130,000 people across multiple secret sites, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and the cost was staggering, around $2 billion back then, which is something like $30 billion in today's money, all for a weapon they weren't even 100% sure would work as planned.
What were the biggest specific hurdles they had to jump?
Oh, there are many. One huge one was getting the fissile material itself. For uranium, the challenge was isotope separation. Natural uranium is over 99% U-238, which isn't easily fissionable. Only about 0.7% is the U-235 isotope you need for a bomb.
And separating those two isotopes is hard.
Incredibly hard. They have almost identical chemical properties. They had to develop entirely new, massive industrial processes like gaseous diffusion and electromagnetic separation at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. These plants were enormous, consumed vast amounts of electricity, and required technologies that simply didn't exist before the project.
And for plutonium, that had to be made, right?
Yeah. Yes. Plutonium-239 doesn't really exist in nature. It had to be created artificially by bombarding U-238 with neutrons inside nuclear reactors. This required building the world's first large-scale production reactors at Hanford, Washington, which itself involved major breakthroughs in reactor design, cooling, fuel handling, and safety.
And we already touched on the implosion design for the plutonium bomb. Those explosive lenses sound like precision engineering nightmare.
They were. Getting conventional explosives to create that perfectly symmetrical, inward-moving shock wave to compress the plutonium core uniformly. It required incredibly complex calculations, new theories about hydrodynamics under extreme pressure, advanced material science, and extremely precise manufacturing and timing.
The timing had to be perfect.
Down to microseconds. All the dozens of detonators around the sphere had to fire at almost exactly the same instant. This spurred huge innovations in high-speed electronics, specialized detonators. It was truly cutting-edge science and engineering across multiple fields, all coordinated under immense pressure.
Led by figures like Oppenheimer and Fermi. It really set a precedent for large-scale, government-funded, militarized science.
It certainly did. And that legacy, the existence of nuclear weapons, and the knowledge to build them, continues to shape our world. How many countries have them now?
As of today, 2025, there are 9 states generally acknowledged to possess nuclear weapons.
Let's see. The U.S., Russia, China, France, the U.K. Those are the 5 official nuclear weapon states under the NPT. Then India, Pakistan, Israel.
And North Korea.
Right, North Korea.
Right.
9 countries, and the total number of warheads is still disturbingly high.
Around 12,000 globally, is that right? With the vast majority held by...
Russia and the United States. Together, they still possess something like 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. Though the numbers are down significantly from Cold War peaks, it's still enough to cause unimaginable catastrophe.
And these aren't like the Hiroshima bomb anymore, are they? Yields are much bigger.
The yields vary enormously. Some modern tactical weapons might be in the kiloton range, similar to or even smaller than Hiroshima. But strategic warheads on missiles can range up into the hundreds of kilotons, or even over a megaton that's equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT, vastly more powerful than the 1945 bombs.
And they can be delivered anywhere.
Pretty much. The main delivery systems formed the nuclear triad: land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, hidden on nuclear subs, and long-range strategic bombers carrying bombs or cruise missiles. This triad ensures survivability and global reach.
There have been efforts to control this, though. Treaties.
Yes, thankfully. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, has been crucial in limiting the spread of nuclear weapons to more countries. And the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, aims to ban all nuclear test explosions, though it hasn't officially entered into force yet because not all required nations have ratified it.
These treaties face challenges.
Absolutely. You have countries outside the NPT framework like India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. You have ongoing geopolitical tensions like between India and Pakistan or involving North Korea that keep the risk of regional nuclear conflict alive. And there's always the nightmare scenario of accidental war due to miscalculation or technical failure or intentional use in a moment of crisis. The risk hasn't disappeared.
So looking ahead, what does the future hold for nuclear weapons? Are things getting better or worse?
It's complex. On the technology front, there are concerns about the development of potentially more usable, low-yield tactical nukes, which some worry could lower the threshold for use. There's also ongoing work on missile defense systems, which sounds good, but could also be destabilizing if one side thinks it can launch a first strike without fear of retaliation. It upsets the MAD balance.
What about diplomacy? Are disarmament efforts making progress?
The ultimate goal of Global Zero, complete disarmament, is still championed by many, formalized in things like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. It won the Nobel Peace Prize for its advocates, ICAN. But the major nuclear powers haven't signed on.
So progress is slow.
Progress on major arms control between, say, the U.S. and Russia has stalled recently due to broader tensions, like the war in Ukraine. These agreements are vital but incredibly sensitive to the overall geopolitical climate. It's a constant struggle.
Are there new kinds of threats emerging in this space?
Definitely. One major worry is proliferation to non-state actors, terrorist groups, getting their hands on fissile material or even a crude bomb. It's a security nightmare. Then there's the cyber dimension, the risk of hacking into command and control systems, potentially causing accidental launch or loss of control.
Wow.
And some analysts even link it to broader global issues. Could climate change, for example, increase resource scarcity and conflict, indirectly raising the risk of nuclear escalation in volatile regions? It's all interconnected.
It's not all doom and gloom, though, right? You mentioned advocacy groups. Public awareness matters.
Hugely. Organizations like ICAN, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and many others play a vital role. They keep the issue in the public eye, educate people about the humanitarian consequences, and push governments toward diplomacy and disarmament. An informed and engaged public is probably one of our best defenses.
Because ultimately, this forces us back to those really fundamental ethical questions. Hannah Arendt called nuclear weapons absolute power, didn't she?
Yes, power on a scale never before seen. And it leads to that core paradox of deterrence. We maintain peace, supposedly, by threatening utter annihilation. Is that morally sustainable? Can it last forever?
Different philosophies and religions must grapple with this differently.
They do. Many religious traditions condemn nuclear weapons outright as inherently immoral due to their indiscriminate nature and potential for catastrophic harm. The Catholic Church, for example, has become increasingly vocal in condemning not just the use, but the very possession of nuclear weapons.
But others might see a justification in deterrence.
Some ethical frameworks, perhaps a purely utilitarian one, might try to weigh the perceived benefits of deterrence, preventing major wars against the enormous risks. But it's a calculation fraught with uncertainty and immense moral weight. There's no easy consensus.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's really clear. Atomic bombs represent this almost unbelievable paradox, a pinnacle of human scientific achievement, yet simultaneously an existential threat to our very survival.
Exactly. Their incredible power, unleashed by cracking open the atom through fission and fusion, was shown with absolutely horrific results in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The consequences: environmental, health, psychological weight. They linger to this day as a stark, constant reminder.
And the ethical questions, the moral dilemmas about possessing and potentially using such power, they remain profoundly challenging, completely unresolved, really.
Which is why understanding this isn't just, an academic exercise about physics or history.
Yeah.
Getting a real grasp of the science, the engineering, and the devastating impact is absolutely crucial. It helps us appreciate the immense stakes involved in nuclear policy, the fragility of our situation, and the absolute urgency of pursuing diplomacy and disarmament.
So maybe the final thought to leave everyone with is this. We've unlocked this incredible, terrifying power, navigating its legacy, managing this double-edged sword of innovation and destruction. Our entire future really hinges on whether we can ensure these weapons remain only a theoretical threat and never, ever become a reality again.